Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Kingston Reif on nuclear abolition. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. And every week it's my pleasure to welcome into the studios here at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, an expert in some important issue area of global governance or international public policy. And today I'm very happy to welcome Kingston Reif, who's the Director of Nuclear Non-Proliferation at the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Kingston. Thanks very much for having me, David. Pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure to have you here because we're going to talk about a hopeful topic. I hope we're going to talk about it hopefully. But the hopeful topic is ridding the world of nuclear weapons. And you've done a lot of work, particularly on the obstacles, the challenges to radically reducing the level of nuclear armament in the world. And I'd like to talk to you about those. But before we get there, let's talk about the necessity for this. Why is it so important, in your view, that we radically reduce, preferably to zero, the level of nuclear weapons in the world?
Thanks for having me, David. Last month was the 50th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think that the biggest lesson from the crisis is that even though the three leaders at the time who were involved in the missile crisis, President John F. Kennedy, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, and Cuban leader Fidel Castro were not seeking or did not want a nuclear war before the crisis broke out, one almost happened anyway. And that there were numerous misjudgments, miscalculations that were made, a lack of empathy, an inability of the parties to the crisis to really get inside the skin and the shoes of the other party and attempt to see the world as they saw it. And all of these failures almost brought us to nuclear Armageddon. And there were a number of things during the crisis that Khrushchev and Kennedy simply could not control once their enormous military machines started preparing for a potential nuclear war. And I think some of those same dangers, the risk that nuclear weapons will be used, exists today. There are still 19,000 nuclear weapons on the planet today in 9 countries, most of them much more powerful than the weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And while most people think, well, didn't the nuclear threat disappear with the Cold War? Nuclear weapons, they're not sort of key instruments of national power anymore, but there are numerous potential flashpoints around the world that could potentially and realistically lead to the use of nuclear weapons. So that's sort of the general, I think, motivating factor, among a few others, behind the quest for ridding the world of nuclear weapons, is that the longer these weapons are in existence, the more likely it is that they one day might be used.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're making some progress. At the height of the Cold War, if I'm not mistaken, there were something in the neighborhood of 70 or 75,000 nuclear weapons, down now to something closer to, I believe that you said the figure was 15,000?
Approximately 19,000.
19,000.
Yep.
Right. So there is progress in that direction. How do we explain that?
Well, I think the biggest reason for that is the end of the Cold War. The United States and then the Soviet Union built enormous nuclear arsenals during the Cold War. But once that confrontation disintegrated in the late 1980s and late 1990s, there was no longer a reason to keep around so many weapons. So both sides, particularly under the leadership of President George H.W. Bush and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and then Russian leader Boris Yeltsin, significantly reduced the size of the US and Russian arsenals. And I think in the United States, one of the reasons you've seen a reduction in the number of nuclear weapons since the Cold War, in addition to the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet threat, is the revolution in military affairs, such that the US is much more reliant on conventional weapons to achieve its national security objectives abroad, and that U.S. military leaders look at nuclear weapons and don't see a particularly useful weapon. And so while military leaders don't think these weapons are particularly useful, if you look still at current U.S. and Russian nuclear postures, you'll still see far too many weapons, given that we're nearly 20 years after the Cold War. I mean, each side together has approximately nearly 18,000 actually, nuclear weapons. And so when you look at their nuclear posture, sometimes you wonder, well, do these weapons, particularly in the U.S. case, really play such a limited role in their national security policy? And what the United States ought to do is try and adjust its nuclear posture to comport with the fact that they do play such a limited role in U.S. national security policy.
You know, you're quite right about that. Just recently, my class examined the most recent U.S. nuclear posture review. And of the 5 planks of U.S. nuclear strategy, pretty much none of them had, only one marginally had something to do with nuclear weapons in terms of providing a role for nuclear weapons. One of them was, plank number 5 in our policy is the importance of getting rid of nuclear weapons.
Right.
So it is hard to figure out what to do with them.
Right.
So the total number of nuclear weapons has dropped since the end of the Cold War, but the total number of nuclear powers has increased. We've gone from 6 to 9. Mm-hmm. Is it that the problem now isn't so much total quantity of nuclear weapons in the world, but the number of countries it has them?
Yeah, I think that, and the nuclear posture review that the United States conducted in 2010 sort of reflected this, that the biggest nuclear threats today aren't the massive arsenals of the Cold War that the United States and Russia had, but they're the threats posed by the spread of nuclear weapons, proliferation, and the threat posed by nuclear terrorism. You mentioned 3 countries have acquired nuclear weapons since the end of the Cold War. 2 of those, Pakistan and India, had pretty vibrant programs pre-Cold War, and you could say they were more or less virtual nuclear powers even at that point. They just sort of formalized it with nuclear tests in 1998 and the development of actual deliverable arsenals. But I think one of the key things animating the drive in recent years on the part of bipartisan former political and government officials and military leaders in the United States is the threat of further nuclear proliferation, and the threat of nuclear terrorism is a reason why there needs to be a global reduction in the number of nuclear weapons, a reduction in the role of nuclear weapons in U.S. national security, and ultimately pursuit of the abolition of nuclear weapons. Because the longer nuclear weapons exist in the numbers that they do today, and the salience that they still that nations still attribute to them in their national security policies, the more likely it is that these weapons could be acquired by other countries, and the terrorists could potentially get their hands on a weapon, or perhaps more likely, the incredible amount of fissile material, or the highly enriched uranium and plutonium that are actually make up the explosive cores of nuclear weapons, that this material could be stolen or acquired by terrorists to wreak terrible destruction.
Very good. We'll be back in a minute. Again with Kingston Reif. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. All right, so let's talk about getting to zero, abolition. So practically speaking, if we want to move from the world as it is today to a world that has no nuclear weapons in it, what are the key tasks? What are the crucial mid-course goals that you would identify, and the important things that have to take place to sequence them properly?
Sure. Well, I think the first thing to recognize is that we're not going to get to zero nuclear weapons in one fell swoop. This is going to be a process, a step-by-step process. It could be long, it could be arduous. There could be 2 steps forward and 1 step backward. There could be points where if countries seize upon this issue and take it seriously, where they decide they can't go any further and want to turn back. But as you mentioned, I think there are some initial goals that we should try to achieve to ultimately put us in a position to realize whether or not abolition is actually possible. And I think one of the first things that needs to happen is that, given that the United States and Russia still have 95% of the nuclear weapons on the planet, they need to make further reductions in the size of their arsenals before you can get some of the other nuclear weapon states, such as China, such as France, such as the United Kingdom, such as India, and such as Pakistan, to come on board with this process. In 2010, the United States and Russia negotiated a new arms control agreement called the New START Treaty, which reduces the size of the deployed Russian and U.S. nuclear arsenals to 1,550 warheads, and also includes a number of verification and monitoring provisions to ensure that both sides are complying with the terms of the treaty. I think the U.S. and Russia need to explore even further reductions, perhaps to as low as 1,000 deployed strategic nuclear warheads, to bring them further down to a level that's much closer to the arsenals that the other countries I just mentioned have in the mid to low hundreds, before you can actually seriously think about getting some of these other countries to come to the table. And I think that's a first step, that while there are challenges, while there are significant challenges, that there will not be an opportunity for the United States and Russia to attempt to achieve moving forward in 2013.
So how many nuclear weapons do you think Russia and the United States might comfortably move down to, given the world as it is today?
Well, I think given the world that is today, in the United States case, that nuclear weapons do not play a significant role in their national security policies. And not only that, given the very strained budget environment in the United States, it costs a lot of money to maintain these weapons, to modernize these weapons. The United States is at a point now where it has to make decisions about recapitalizing all three legs of its so-called nuclear triad: its land-based missiles, its submarine launch ballistic missiles, and then its heavy bombers, which are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. And it is simply not going to be able to afford to modernize and replace all of its existing systems, which are aging. So there's going to be an opportunity not only strategically to reduce the size of the arsenal, but economically it makes sense to do so as well. Russia, given its weaker conventional power, given its concerns about U.S. conventional dominance, given its concerns about U.S. missile defense programs, has unfortunately been placing a greater emphasis on nuclear weapons and is likely to be more resistant to further reductions. At the same time, however, Russia's nuclear forces are aging. It's modernizing its forces, but it is not modernizing its forces quickly enough to keep up with the older systems that Russia is taking offline. So the size of its arsenal is going to shrink naturally, almost by default, over the course of the next decade. So given all of those factors that I just outlined, I think there's an opportunity for the U.S. and for Russia to come to an agreement to further reduce the size of their nuclear arsenals. And I think a good target for deployed forces, which is the weapons that are actually on missiles and bombers, is about 1,000. But also to try and have a limit, and these weapons have never been limited before, on the number of warheads and weapons that the United States and Russia actually keep in reserve as a hedge. As I said, those weapons have never been limited, so I think there's an opportunity to actually cap the size of those forces, maybe at 2,000 to 3,000 warheads, and that would be a significant progress. So there are going to be challenges and obstacles, but as I said, there are some factors which ought to make this a realistic possibility. Now,
both of those countries are actually obliged under international treaty to get rid of their nuclear weapons entirely.
Correct.
There's no deadline, but the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty does commit them to that.
Correct.
So they're supposed to do it anyway.
Right.
What about other countries such as Britain and France? They still have nuclear arsenals, but without any obvious reason or justification. Is there not a window of opportunity here for, say, Britain and or France to spur this process toward abolition by essentially saying, okay, we no longer need these, we no longer want them? Would that be constructive? And if so, why aren't they willing to talk about this?
I think that would be very constructive. If you look at Great Britain, some of the economic forces that I just mentioned in regards to the United States and also to Russia are going to impact Britain. Their nuclear warheads are postured on only one delivery system now, submarines and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. They're at a point, given the relationship between the U.S. and British nuclear forces, the two programs sort of co-developed together, the British submarines are aging and are in need of replacement. And this is going to cost a monumental sum of money. And Great Britain is facing its own economic problems, and there's a big debate about whether or not to move forward with not only modernizing the subs, but also on the scale that is currently planned. So that's an issue that Great Britain is going to have to deal with. France is a very interesting case. They did not sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty until late in the 1980s, as I recall, perhaps even the early 1990s. And they have not given any indications that they are interested in giving up their weapons, although it's difficult to see a legitimate national security reason for them to keep them around. I think
it's a prestige issue?
I think it's definitely a prestige issue. I also think it's a loss aversion issue. And this goes for any country that has nuclear weapons that is interested in or that may be asked to think about getting rid of them is the question of, well, we've had these things forever. What kind of world are we going to live in without them? It's not clear to us what kind of world we're going to live in. Who knows what threats might exist one day? Who knows if the United States will always be there for us? So they come up with justifications in terms of why they should keep the arsenal around. But I mean, if you look at this issue objectively and dispassionately, it's fine to come up with a meaningful strategic rationale for why the United Kingdom and France need to maintain their own independent nuclear deterrence.
Very interesting. We'll be back again with Kingston Reif to talk about nuclear abolition. You are watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So we've talked a bit about some of the established long-time nuclear weapon states and what they ought to be doing to help us toward abolition. What about the relatively new nuclear weapon states, the countries such as North Korea, India, Pakistan, also Israel, who's never officially acknowledged that they have nuclear weapons? How do we encourage these countries to think that getting rid of their nuclear weapons is actually a good idea?
Well, I think one thing that has to happen is that the other nuclear powers, the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, will have to exhibit a willingness to continue to reduce the size of their nuclear arsenals and also the role that those arsenals play in their national security policy. That in and of itself isn't going to be probably good enough to convince countries like Iran or North Korea to give up their arsenals, but certainly further reductions and further disarmament on the part of the P5, I think, is important in convincing the rest of the non-nuclear weapon states whose support we need for tougher non-proliferation and enforcement measures against countries like Iran and North Korea. These non-nuclear weapon states are going to want to see further disarmament. India and Pakistan is a very difficult issue. It's a very concerning and, quite frankly, terrifying potential nuclear flashpoint. Given the nuclear postures and policies outlined by India and China, it's conceivable that a bomb going off, a terrorist bomb going off in New Delhi could actually lead to a nuclear exchange between India and Pakistan. I think the best thing we can hope for there at this moment is to try and get them to continue further confidence-building measures regarding their force postures, transparency measures regarding their nuclear arsenals, but also to see what headway can be made on the Kashmir issue, because that's one of the key issues, security issues, that drives the Indian and Pakistani felt need for nuclear weapons. In the case of India, a lot is linked to China, and so a lot of India's development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, for example, is clearly aimed at deterring China. So the India-China relationship is also going to be one that's going to have to be stabilized. Israel, the Middle East, also a very difficult issue. Israel does not formally declare that it has nuclear weapons, but it's well known that they have approximately 100 to 200 or so such weapons. There has been discussion, and this was included in the final document of the 2010 Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, about what might be required for a nuclear weapons or WMD, weapons of mass destruction, free zone in the Middle East. And that might be a mechanism by which the Israelis could eventually give up their weapons. But before Israel does decide to get rid of its weapons, it is going to require that the rest of the Arab countries in the Middle East, with which it has difficult relations, is going to recognize Israel's legitimate security concerns. And the same is going to have to go vis-a-vis Israel and its adversaries in the Middle East. That is going to have to recognize their legitimate security concerns as well.
Now, we don't worry about British or American or French nuclear weapons here in Canada. And so some people might be tempted to say the only way you can confidently persuade countries to get rid of nuclear weapons that they have and not to worry about other countries is to solve their basic security challenges and to improve their relations to the point where they're as good as US-Canadian or British-Canadian relations. That seems like that's a pretty long-term project in the Middle East. maybe long-term on the Korean Peninsula, depending on how much time the North Korean regime actually has. Are we talking about having to wait a generation, 2 generations, until it's actually imaginable that the underlying political disputes in some parts of the world make it ripe to talk about nuclear abolition?
For some of the tough cases I just mentioned, yes, I think a prerequisite is going to be the resolution of some of these territorial and sovereignty disputes and issues that give rise to the security concerns and dilemmas that in turn give rise for the felt need to acquire nuclear weapons. But as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of steps the existing nuclear powers can take, particularly the United States and Russia, to reduce the size of their still incredibly bloated nuclear arsenals, and that this can create momentum for not only including some of the other nuclear armed states who have much smaller arsenals in the disarmament process, but can also play a role as well in demonstrating the limited importance of nuclear weapons in national and global security. Nuclear weapons aren't the only reason why Pakistan and India, the other's nuclear arsenal isn't the only reason that they're worried about their security concerns. So those are going to have to be stabilized. But you know, if we begin the process, that process could potentially create its own momentum and make issues and problems that seem intractable or very difficult to tackle right now actually seem possible down the road.
Very good. We'll be back one last time with Kingston Reif. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So let's talk about the governance dimension. You work for a civil society organization, a nonprofit, and there are a number of intergovernmental organizations involved in nuclear non-proliferation and encouraging reduction in the reliance of nuclear weapons worldwide. What needs to be done to strengthen, improve, fill the gaps in the governance, the global governance of this issue to help pave the way towards reductions and possible eventual abolition?
Well, there are a lot of governance issues concerning not only the nuclear weapons issue, but also the civilian nuclear energy issue, which is inextricably linked to the weapons issue, because the same technology that can be used to make nuclear fuel for civilian power reactors can also be used to make the highly enriched uranium and separated plutonium that make up the explosive cores of nuclear weapons. So global governance is already plays a very important role regarding nuclear weapons and civilian nuclear power. The Non-Proliferation Treaty's regulatory arm, the International Atomic Energy Association, is tasked with ensuring that non-nuclear weapons states are not diverting or using their civilian nuclear programs for illicit weapons purposes. This is the big problem in Iran, that Iran has not lived up to its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and under the International Atomic Energy Association. Its continued enrichment of uranium is a violation of the rules that it agreed to with the IAEA. So strengthening the IAEA is certainly something that will need to be done, I think, to build confidence as we move toward further reductions in nuclear arsenals and to build confidence that civilian nuclear programs are not used ultimately for weapons purposes. I've seen statistics suggesting that the budget for the IAEA is about the operating budget of the city of Seattle. So the budget needs to be increased significantly, and they need to be given greater and more expansive powers in terms of monitoring and inspection. There are also other global governance mechanisms, such as the Conference on Disarmament, which is where important international multilateral treaties, such as the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Chemical Weapons Convention, were negotiated. The Conference of Disarmament many countries have attempted to encourage the Conference on Disarmament to negotiate, which is known as the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty, treaty, which would prevent the production of highly enriched uranium and separated plutonium, actually prohibit the production of this material for weapons purposes. But the Conference on Disarmament operates on the basis of consensus, meaning that any one nation can object to a work plan and to the negotiation of a particular agreement. And Pakistan, which is producing large amounts of fissile material and increasing the size of their nuclear arsenal, has objected to the negotiation of such a material cutoff treaty in the Conference on Disarmament. So some nations have begun to talk about, well, might there be other avenues to try and begin the negotiation process of such a treaty and try to bring in a country such as Pakistan much later in the game. So there's all sorts of global governance issues associated with the nuclear issue. And as we attempt to take further steps to reducing the number of nuclear weapons and developing stronger monitoring and inspection provisions around civilian nuclear programs, these global governance mechanisms are going to have to take on a much greater role.
Mm-hmm. And tell us a bit about your organization and the kind of role it seeks to play.
Sure. So my organization, the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, and then also the Council for a Livable World, basically two sides of the same coin. We're located in Washington, D.C., and we're dedicated to reducing the dangers posed by nuclear weapons and nuclear material, as well as calling for a more saner and practicable Pentagon or military spending and budgets. We're also committed to addressing the Iranian and North Korean nuclear programs through diplomacy. Our principal constituents and consumers are members of Congress and their staff, the media, opinion leaders, but then also the general public. And the unique thing about the Council for a Livable World, which is our lobbying and advocacy arm, is we actually raise money for candidates for the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives across the country who are committed and dedicated to also reducing the nuclear threat, committed to arms control and disarmament, and then also hope that through the fundraising efforts and getting them elected to Congress, that they will then be champions on these issues once they are in Congress. The Council, which is the first of the two organizations, the Council and the Center. The Council was first. The Council was actually founded by former Manhattan Project scientists who realized the dangers that they had unleashed, and that one of the ways that would be needed to reduce the threat and combat the dangers posed by these weapons was to ensure that we got members of Congress elected who cared deeply about this goal, given that Congress plays such an important role in the United States in terms of controlling the power of the purse, but also having a big role in foreign policy and national security issues.
And do you have cognate institutions in other nuclear weapon states?
We do not. No, it's just we're a small organization in Washington.
Mm-hmm. So where the need is greatest, the supply is least.
Right.
Thank you so much for coming in and talking to us about this. It's obviously very important about a long-term project. And good luck with your lobbying and advocacy and consciousness raising. And to our audience, thank you for joining us, and join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.